Sweat and canvas smell exactly like arrogance when you haven't tasted defeat in 3 years. Clara pointed across the frayed mats at a wiry man in a faded track jacket, expecting a lazy warm-up. She had no idea she just invited an earthquake into a house of cards. Blood tastes like old pennies, but victory tastes like nothing at all. Clara spat a mouthful of lukewarm water into the dented aluminum spittoon beside the ring, wiping a stray bead of sweat from her eyebrow with the back of a taped wrist. 3 years undefeated. 3 years of gold-plated plastic trophies, hollow congratulations, and a growing numbness that settled deep in her marrow. Silver Street Dojo was a basement joint, smelling permanently of bleach, oxidized iron, and damp guy cotton. It wasn't pretty. Paint peeled from the cinderblock walls in long gray strips like sunburned skin, and the fluorescent tubes overhead hummed with a frantic, dying wasp energy. Clara sat on the edge of the raised platform, unspooling a roll of white athletic tape. She rapped her knuckles, pulling the adhesive tight enough to cut off the circulation just a fraction. Pain was an anchor. It kept her present when her mind wanted to drift. Mateo, the head coach, was screaming at a novice in the corner. His voice was a gravelly bark that bounced off the low ceiling. A few feet away, Vince, a heavyweight who hit like a freight train but moved like a glacier, pounded a heavy bag rhythmically. Thud, pause, thud, pause. The noise was chaotic, suffocating, and entirely familiar. Clara loved it once. Now, it just gave her a tension headache that started at the base of her skull and radiated inward. She stood up, testing her weight on her bare feet. The canvas mat felt cold and slightly sticky under her soles. She needed a sparring partner. Heavyweight Vince was out. He had zero control and bruised her ribs last Tuesday. Julian was out sick. The rest of the regulars were either too terrified of her or too eager to prove themselves, making them sloppy and dangerous. That was when she saw him. He sat on a folding metal chair near the entrance, holding a canvas gym bag on his lap. He didn't belong here. Silver Street bred bruisers, men and women built like fire hydrants and brick walls. This guy was slight, almost severely thin in his faded blue track jacket and dark slacks. His dark hair was neatly parted, and he watched the room with a calm, unnerving stillness. He wasn't scrolling on a phone, he wasn't fidgeting. He just sat, his dark eyes tracking the movements of the fighters with the casual interest of a man watching fish in an aquarium. Clara let out a slow exhale, smelling the bitter tang of wintergreen muscle rub radiating from her own shoulders. She didn't want a war today. She wanted a moving target, someone to practice her distancing, to break a light sweat, and then go home to ice her perpetually aching knees. "Hey!" Clara called out, her voice cutting through the dull roar of the gym. The stranger didn't flinch, but his eyes shifted to her. "You got gear in that bag?" she asked, nodding toward his lap. He looked down at the bag, then back up at her, offering a small, polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "A little." "Put it on," Clara said. She wasn't asking. 3 years at the top of the food chain strips away your manners. "I need 3 rounds. Light contact. I won't take your head off, I just need to move." Mateo stopped yelling at the novice and glanced over. He frowned, wiping his bald head with a towel. "Clara, leave the tourists alone. You want to move, Shadowbox." "Shadowboxing doesn't hit back," Clara retorted, unbothered. She kept her eyes on the stranger. "Well, you want to bleed a little on a real mat or just watch?" It was a rude thing to say, cheap even. Clara felt a brief stab of self-disgust, a sharp contrast to the manufactured confidence she wore like armor. She was tired, her left hamstring was barking, and she was taking it out on a guy who probably weighed 140 pounds soaking wet. The stranger didn't look offended. If anything, the corners of his mouth twitched upward, a micro-expression of quiet amusement. He stood up. He moved silently, his footsteps making absolutely no sound on the grit-covered linoleum floor. 3 rounds, he said. His voice was soft, carrying a slight musical cadence. Light contact. I would enjoy that. Clara rolled her shoulders, hearing the familiar, sickening little pops of cartilage. Don't say I didn't warn you. Bare feet striking damp canvas usually make a distinct heavy sound, a wet slap followed by the grinding friction of skin against texture. When the stranger stepped onto the sparring area, he made absolutely zero noise. Clara noticed his feet first. They were the feet of a laborer, not a modern athlete. The skin around his heels and the balls of his feet was thick, yellowed and heavily calloused, hardened into natural leather from decades of pivoting on unyielding surfaces. He didn't wear ankle wraps. He didn't wear shin guards. He stood in simple black canvas trousers and a thin white cotton t-shirt that clung to a surprisingly dense frame, corded with wire cable muscle that looked entirely devoid of body fat. It was his posture, however, that made Clara's jaw tighten. When an amateur steps onto a mat with a local champion, they invariably puff up. They raise their shoulders, tuck their chins aggressively to protect their neck, and bounce erratically on their toes to burn off the sudden toxic dump of adrenaline. They try to look big. They try to look dangerous. The stranger did absolutely none of that. He stood perfectly, terrifyingly relaxed. His arms hung loosely at his sides, his shoulders draped naturally without a fraction of manufactured tension. His knees were barely bent. If Clara watched closely, she could see that his chest hardly moved when he inhaled. He was breathing deep into his abdomen, slow and rhythmic, utterly unbothered by the violent context of his surroundings. Clara tapped her padded leather gloves together. Smack, smack. Dust particles danced briefly in the harsh fluorescent light above them. "Ready?" she asked, her voice flat, betrayed by a slight rasp of chronic dehydration. He offered a slight traditional bow. It was an economical tilt of the head and a brief lowering of his dark eyes that lasted only a fraction of a second. It wasn't a submission. It was merely an acknowledgement of the space they were about to share. Clara didn't bow back. She brought her hands up into a high, rigid guard, her elbows tucked tightly against her ribs, and began to bounce on her toes. She initiated her familiar rhythm, the bouncing acting as a metronome for the violence she was about to dispense. She decided to start with a standard probing sequence, a sharp left jab to gauge his reaction time and force him to blink, immediately followed by a low inside leg kick just to let him know she possessed terrible intentions. She wasn't going to hurt him. She genuinely intended to pull the punch at the last millimeter, but she wanted him to feel the wind of it. She wanted him to flinch. Pushing off her back foot, Clara's hips snapped violently. Her fist tore through the humid, bleach-scented air, aimed perfectly at the bridge of his nose. Her mechanics were flawless, the result of 3 years spent bleeding into these very mats. But her glove met empty space. There was no panicked parry. There was no desperate block. The stranger simply wasn't occupying that specific piece of geography anymore. He had shifted his weight, a millimeter, maybe 2, pivoting on those calloused heels, and her fist sailed harmlessly past his ear. It was like punching a vacuum. The sudden lack of resistance pulled Clara slightly off balance, a jarring mechanical failure that sent a harsh shockwave up her own forearm. Clara frowned, her brow furrowing deeply. She aborted the planned leg kick, instantly recovering her stance, and threw a blistering right cross. She put her shoulder into it this time, pivoting her back foot hard to generate torque. It was a meaner, faster strike, designed to track a retreating target. Swish. He slipped it entirely. He ducked under her extended arm with a fluidity that looked like water pouring smoothly over a jagged stone. The movement was entirely devoid of panic. Before Clara could retract her arm to protect her centerline, she felt something feather-light press against her left side. She snapped her eyes downward. The stranger's first 2 fingers were pressed directly against her floating rib. He hadn't struck her. He had merely placed his hand there, hovering exactly over her exposed liver, lingering for half a breathless second before pulling his hand away. A cold, sharp spike of adrenaline pierced Clara's stomach, immediately chased by a hot flush of embarrassment. He could have broken my rib right there, her nervous system whispered to her brain. He could have folded me in half. She pushed the intrusive thought down, burying it under layers of hot, defensive anger. "Lucky slip," Clara muttered, her voice tight. She bounced backward, widening her stance, her bare soles squeaking sharply against the canvas. She was no longer treating this like a warm-up. The fatigue that had previously weighed down her hamstrings evaporated entirely, replaced by a hyper-vigilant electric buzz that made her skin crawl. She dug her toes into the mat. She advanced, closing the distance rapidly, throwing a high-volume flurry. She launched a crisp 1-2 combination to blind his center of vision, preparing her hips for the kill shot. She planted her lead foot and launched a spinning back kick. It was her signature move, the technique that had laid out 3 different women in the regional finals. It was a beautiful, violent arc of kinetic energy. Her heel, whistling through the dense air of the dojo, aimed perfectly for the space where his jaw was supposed to be. She envisioned the satisfying, dull thud of padded leather meeting bone. It hit nothing but stale air. Clara over-rotated violently. Her momentum, completely unchecked by a target, carried her awkwardly forward. She stumbled, her arms flailing for a microsecond as she fought gravity. Her foot slapped loudly against the canvas as she finally caught her balance, her back completely exposed. In that terrible, vulnerable second, she felt a tap on the back of her neck. Just a tap. 2 fingers, light as a moth's wing, resting directly on her brainstem. Clara froze. Her lungs stopped working. The sweat rolling down the bridge of her nose felt suddenly like ice water. She didn't notice it happening, but the chaotic, suffocating symphony of Silver Street Dojo had ceased entirely. Vince had stopped pounding the heavy bag. He stood motionless, his massive, tattooed arms wrapped around the leather cylinder, staring blankly at the mat. Mateo, the loud-mouthed head coach, had literally dropped his dirty towel onto the linoleum floor. Even the frantic buzzing of the dying fluorescent tubes overhead seemed to have muted itself, offering a sickening reverence to what had just occurred. 20 pairs of eyes were locked squarely on the 2 of them. Clara turned slowly, her hands dropping uselessly to her sides. The stranger stood a few feet away, already back in his loose, unbothered stance. He wasn't breathing hard. He hadn't even broken a sweat. The air around him felt physically heavier, charged with a dense atmospheric pressure that made the fine hairs on Clara's arms stand at rigid attention. "What are you?" Clara breathed. The words slipped past her lips before her cynical pride could swallow them. Her chest heaved dramatically, her lungs desperately pulling in the stale, damp air, trying to oxygenate a body running entirely on panic. I am just a guest," the stranger said softly. His voice carried that same slight musical cadence, entirely undisturbed by the physical exertion. "Your spinning kick is very powerful. It possesses great speed. But you telegraph your intention with your left shoulder. You wind it up like a baseball pitcher. You warn your opponent before you fire." Clara swallowed hard. Her throat felt lined with crushed glass. She was the undefeated champion. She was the apex predator of this basement, the one who dispensed the brutal critiques. But standing here, under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the overhead lights, looking at a man who weighed 30 pounds less than her, she felt like an absolute beginner. She looked at his hands. They were resting loosely near his waist, his knuckles mapped with small, pale scars, the veins in his forearms thick and prominent. There was a terrifying economy to his very existence. No wasted movement, no wasted breath. He didn't fight the air. He occupied it perfectly. "Again," Clara said. Her voice trembled. It was a tiny, humiliating vibration that betrayed the awe and absolute terror warring inside her chest. She raised her heavy leather gloves, but they felt waterlogged now, weighed down by a crushing, sudden doubt. The stranger smiled. It was a genuine, warm expression that crinkled the corners of his dark eyes, utterly devoid of the arrogance Clara was so used to seeing in fighters. "Of course," he replied smoothly, "but this time, do not try to hit me. Try to hit the space where I am going to be." Frustration burned in Clara's throat like swallowed battery acid. She nodded, her jaw locked so tightly her molars ached. "Hit the space where he is going to be." It sounded like fortune cookie garbage, the kind of pseudo-mystical nonsense sold in strip mall dojos. But the stinging reality of his 2 fingers against her brainstem argued otherwise. She re-engaged, circling him to her left, trying to find an angle. Her bare feet scuffed the canvas, a rough, rhythmic sandpaper sound that seemed deafening in the otherwise silent room. She watched his shoulders, his hips, the space between his collarbones, the traditional anchors of fighter studies to predict movement. There was nothing. No tension gathering in his deltoids, no subtle shifting of the weight to a plant foot. He was a blank slate. Clara bit down on her mouthpiece and launched a tight, economical jab, immediately following it with a left hook, doubling up on the same side to catch him slipping outside. It was a professional combination, born of thousands of hours grinding on the heavy bag until her knuckles bled through her wraps. She felt a sharp, stinging slap on her forearm. He hadn't blocked the jab, he had simply swatted it downward, a crisp, percussive smack of flesh on wet skin, and stepped into her guard. Before her hook could even begin its arc, his lead foot trapped hers, pinning her toes to the mat. Panic, cold and sharp, flared in her chest. She was immobilized. His fist stopped half an inch from the bridge of her nose. The sudden deceleration of his punch pushed a tiny puff of displaced air against her eyelashes. Clara froze, her hook hanging uselessly in the air, her balance completely compromised. "You are fighting your own memory." His voice was a quiet murmur, meant only for her, entirely divorced from the violent context of their bodies. "You threw the hook because it is what you always throw after that jab. You did not look to see if I was actually there to be hit. You are fighting a ghost." He stepped back, releasing her foot. Clara stumbled away, her chest heaving. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a grating, electric drone that mirrored the sudden chaotic buzzing in her own skull. She was the champion. She had a shelf full of hardware that said she was the best in the tri-state area. Yet, standing before this man in a faded track jacket, she felt like a toddler wearing lead boots, flailing blindly in the dark. "Shut up!" she hissed, the words slipping around her mouthguard. It was a pathetic, childish response, and she hated herself for it the moment it left her lips. She didn't wait for him to set. She charged. All technique evaporated, replaced by a raw, desperate pride. She threw a barrage of strikes, crosses, looping overhands, a desperate push kick. She wanted to connect just once to prove that he was flesh and bone, governed by the same laws of physics as everyone else in Silver Street. It was a masterclass in humiliation. He didn't retreat. He didn't run. He stayed perfectly within her striking range, swaying, pivoting, and slipping. He moved with a terrifying liquid efficiency. Every time Clara committed her weight to a strike, she found only empty air and immediately felt the agonizingly light tap of his fingers on a vulnerable target. Tap her temple, tap her solar plexus, tap the inside of her knee. He was dismantling her, not with force, but with absolute truth. He was exposing the gaping holes in her armor, the rigid, predictable patterns she had built her entire career upon. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts to her ego. Her lungs felt packed with hot sand. The wintergreen scent of her muscle rub was now completely overpowered by the sharp ammonia tang of her own fear sweat. She threw a massive looping right hand, a sloppy, exhausting haymaker born entirely of exhaustion and rage. He didn't slip it. He intercepted it. As her arm traveled forward, his hand shot out like a striking viper. He didn't aim for her face. He aimed for the weapon. His knuckles crashed into her bicep, perfectly striking the bundle of nerves resting against the bone. Clara let out a choked gasp as her right arm instantly went dead. It dropped to her side, entirely numb, a heavy, useless appendage. Her momentum carried her forward, unbalanced and vulnerable. He didn't strike her. Instead, he simply placed his palm flat against her chest and pushed. It wasn't a violent shove. It was a heavy, inevitable transfer of weight. Clara's feet tangled. She fell backward, hitting the mat hard. The damp, sweat-stained canvas slapped against her spine, knocking the wind out of her in a sharp, painful whoosh. She lay there, staring up at the peeling gray ceiling, her chest rising and falling in ragged, uneven jerks. The numbness in her arm was slowly fading, replaced by a deep, throbbing ache. The silence in the gym was absolute. The only sound was the frantic rasp of her own breathing. She didn't want to get up. For 3 years, she'd carried the exhausting weight of being invincible. Now, lying flat on her back, staring at a water stain shaped like a lung on the acoustic tiles, she felt a strange, profound relief. The armor was gone. The lie was dead. A shadow fell over her face, blocking the harsh glare of the fluorescent tubes. Clara blinked the stinging sweat from her eyes. The stranger was standing over her. He wasn't gloating. His breathing was still slow, rhythmic, completely undisturbed. He extended a hand toward her. Clara looked at it. His skin was smooth but dense, the knuckles flattened and heavily calloused from years of hitting iron and wood. She hesitated, her pride fighting a dying, pathetic rearguard action in her chest. Slowly, she reached up with her good left hand and gripped his. His grip was warm, dry, and terrifyingly strong. He pulled her to her feet with zero visible effort, hoisting her up as if she weighed no more than a wet towel. "Time," Mateo's voice cracked from the edge of the mat. The word sounded foreign, intrusive, as if he were breaking a sacred spell. Clara stood swaying slightly, her dead right arm trembling as circulation violently returned. She looked at the stranger, really looked at him this time. She looked past the faded track jacket and the unassuming stature. She saw the absolute stillness in his eyes, a serene, terrifying void that held no anger, no ego, no fear. "Why didn't you put me to sleep?" Clara asked. Her voice was a raspy whisper. Her throat felt raw. "You had my chin 3 times. You could have taken my head off." He began to untie the drawstring of his canvas pants, adjusting the waistband casually. "Because breaking a board is easy," he said, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "A board does not hit back. A board does not learn. You are not a board." He turned and walked toward his folding metal chair. He moved with that same silent feline grace, his bare feet making no sound on the gritty floor. Clara followed him, stopping a few feet away. She was shivering, the adrenaline crash hitting her system like a physical blow. The gym remained entirely frozen. Vince was still hugging his heavy bag. The novices were clustered in the corner, mouths slightly parted. No one dared to squeak a sneaker on the linoleum. "You fight like a statue," the stranger said, picking up his canvas gym bag. He slung the strap over his shoulder. "Beautiful form, perfect mechanics, but a statue is made of stone. When a storm comes, the statue tries to resist the wind. It stands rigid, and eventually it cracks." He turned to face her, his dark eyes locking onto hers. You must not be stone. You must be water," he said softly. "When water hits a rock, it does not argue with the rock. It does not try to break the rock with a single rigid punch. It flows around it. It finds the crack. It fills the space. You hold your breath when you strike, Clara. You lock your jaw. You tense your shoulders. You are fighting the air, the canvas, and your own skeleton before you even reach your opponent." Clara swallowed, tasting blood and salt. "How do I fix it?" It was a total surrender. The undefeated champion of Silver Street Dojo, begging for scraps of knowledge from a tourist in a dirty basement. The stranger smiled. It was that same warm, crinkling smile from before, utterly devoid of malice or superiority. "Stop trying to win," he said simply. "Start trying to understand." He offered that small, traditional bow again, a tilt of the head, a brief lowering of the eyes. This time, Clara bowed back. She bent at the waist, a deep, clumsy, respectful bow, her dead right arm dangling awkwardly. "Thank you," she whispered to the floor. When she straightened up, he was already walking toward the exit. The heavy metal door at the top of the concrete stairs stood propped open, spilling a harsh rectangle of late afternoon sunlight into the dim basement. Mateo suddenly stepped forward, his face pale, sweating profusely despite having done nothing but watch. He grabbed a damp towel and wiped his bald head, his eyes tracking the man's departure. "Hey!" Mateo called out, his normally booming voice cracking slightly. "Hey, friend." The stranger paused at the bottom of the concrete stairs, looking back over his shoulder. He was silhouetted against the bright rectangular glare of the street level, a dark, lean shape bathed in harsh light. "You got a name?" Mateo asked, swallowing loudly. "Just in case I need to log you in the guest book." The stranger stood there for a long moment. The dust motes danced violently in the shaft of sunlight illuminating him. "Bruce," he said quietly. He turned and walked up the stairs, his footsteps echoing faintly on the concrete, before disappearing entirely into the noise of the city above. The heavy metal door slowly clicked shut on its hydraulic hinge, plunging the basement back into its familiar fluorescent gloom. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, thick with the smell of sweat and shattered illusions. No one moved. No one spoke. For an endless minute, the only sound in Silver Street Dojo was the frantic dying hum of the overhead lights. Clara stood perfectly still on the canvas. She reached up with her left hand, gently touching the side of her neck, right below the jawline. Her fingers pressed against her pulse. It was racing, beating a frantic, terrified, exhilarating rhythm against her skin. She turned and looked across the gym. Above the water fountain, a cheap wooden shelf sagged under the weight of a dozen gold-plated plastic trophies. They gleamed dully under the terrible lighting. An hour ago, they were the anchors of her entire identity. They were proof of her worth. Now, looking at them, Clara felt absolutely nothing. They were just plastic. They were just dust. She reached down, grabbed the thick white athletic tape wrapped around her knuckles, and ripped it off in one violent, stinging motion. The adhesive tore out tiny hairs, a sharp, grounding pain that made her inhale sharply. She dropped the crumpled wad of tape onto the mat. "Mateo," Clara said, her voice finally breaking the absolute silence of the room. It sounded different, lower, calmer. Mateo flinched, turning to look at her. "Yeah, kid?" Clara looked back at the empty space on the mat, the exact spot where the stranger had stood, where he had made her a ghost in her own house. "Wipe the board," Clara said, turning her back on her trophies. "We're starting over. If Clara's story hit a nerve, you're not alone. We all build walls of ego to protect ourselves, but real growth only happens when someone, or something, tears them down. Were you expecting that kind of brutal truth from a stranger? Drop a comment below with your own ego death moment. If you want more raw, unfiltered stories that punch straight to the gut, smash that like button, share this with a fighter you know, and subscribe to the channel. Stay grounded.